The Pacific Ocean is a graveyard of ambition. Deep beneath the crushing pressure of the black water, steel skeletons rest in eternal silence, monuments to the violence of the 20th century. Among these lost legends lies a vessel that was never meant to be a victim. She was a monster of her time, a ship built not to hide in the shadows, but to dominate them. She was the largest submarine the United States Navy would ever build until the nuclear age. She was a minelayer, a troop transport, and a warrior that carried the pride of a nation desperate to project power across a limitless ocean. This is the story of the USS Argonaut. She was slow, she was cumbersome, and she was loud. But for the men who served inside her pressure hull, she was home, and eventually she would become their iron tomb. Before we descend into the history of this iron giant, please take a brief moment to click the subscribe button to support our work in preserving these military histories. To understand the tragedy of the Argonaut, one must first understand the era that forged her. The narrative begins not with gunfire, but with ink on paper. The First World War had ended, leaving the world horrified by the devastation of industrial slaughter. The great powers sought to limit the instruments of war, culminating in the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. Battleships were restricted, tonnage was capped, and the world's navies were forced to innovate within strict boundaries. But the treaty had loopholes, and the minds at the United States Navy were already looking toward the vast, unguarded expanse of the Pacific. They needed eyes that could see across thousands of miles. They needed endurance. They envisioned a new class of submarine, the V-boats, designed for long-range patrols and heavy operations far from the comfort of Pearl Harbor or San Diego. From this strategic desperation, the V-4 was conceived. Laid down in May of 1925 at the Portsmouth Navy Yard, she was an experiment in excess. While other nations were building sleek, stealthy predators, the United States built a behemoth. When she was launched in November of 1927, she displaced over 2,700 tons on the surface and more than 4,000 tons when submerged. She was massive. The sheer scale of her hull was staggering to the sailors who walked her decks. She was not merely a tube of steel. She was a complex industrial city designed to wage war on a grand scale. She was commissioned initially as the V-4, but she would earn the name that would carry her into history: Argonaut. Her design was a paradox of power and vulnerability. She was the first of the second generation of V-boats, and her primary mission was distinct. She was a minelayer. The Argonaut was equipped with 2 aft mine-laying tubes and carried 60 Mark 11 mines. Her purpose was to sneak into enemy waters, lay a field of explosive death, and vanish before the enemy knew they were trapped. But she was also a gunfighter. Unlike the smaller submarines that would dominate the later war years, Argonaut carried 2 6-inch naval guns on her deck. These were not small-caliber weapons for scaring off fishing boats. These were cruiser-grade weapons intended to sink merchant ships on the surface. She was built with the philosophy that a submarine should be able to fight it out in the open air if necessary. However, this ambition came with a heavy price. The Argonaut was plagued by the physics of her own existence. She was powered by manned diesel engines that were notoriously finicky and vibrated with such intensity that they could rattle the teeth of the crew. She was slow, struggling to make speed on the surface, and underwater she was a sluggish beast. But her most fatal flaw was her diving time. In a war where seconds meant the difference between life and death, the Argonaut took an agonizingly long time to slip beneath the waves. To submerge this leviathan required a complex ballet of flooding massive ballast tanks, a procedure that left her exposed and vulnerable for dangerous minutes. The sailors knew this. They knew that if they were caught on the surface by a fast destroyer or a diving aircraft, the Argonaut would struggle to hide. Throughout the 1930s, the Argonaut served as a test bed for naval doctrine. She participated in fleet problems, simulated attacks, and long-endurance cruises. She became a familiar sight at Pearl Harbor, her massive silhouette distinct against the Hawaiian sunset. She was the Pearl of the Navy, a symbol of American engineering might. But, as the decade closed, the horizon began to darken. Relations with the Empire of Japan were deteriorating. The Pacific was becoming a powder keg, and the Argonaut, now an aging giant, was sitting right in the center of the coming storm. The Navy began to realize that the concept of the slow, heavy cruiser submarine might be obsolete in the face of modern aviation and sonar, yet she was what they had. In late 1941, the tension was palpable. The Argonaut was at sea, patrolling the waters near Midway Island. The crew went about their routines, the smell of diesel and sweat permeating the air, the rhythmic thrum of the engines serving as the heartbeat of their existence. Then came the morning of December 7th. The radio operator sat hunched over his equipment, static filling his ears, until a message cut through the noise. It was a message that would change the world forever. Air Raid Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. The shock was absolute. Thousands of miles away, the main battle fleet of the United States Navy was burning in the oil-slicked waters of the harbor. The Argonaut was suddenly no longer a peacetime patrol vessel. She was a lone warrior on the front lines of a war that had just begun with a catastrophic defeat. The captain and crew knew that the Japanese fleet was out there, somewhere in the vast blue emptiness. They were at war, and they were alone. As the sun began to set on that day of infamy, the Argonaut found herself near Midway, a tiny atoll that would soon become legendary. The Japanese destroyers, the Sazanami, and the Ushio emerged from the twilight. They were sleek, fast, and deadly, tasked with shelling the American airfield on Midway to soften it up for invasion. This was the moment the Argonaut was built for. This was the moment to unleash her power. The Argonaut moved to intercept. The crew was at battle stations, adrenaline surging through their veins. The captain ordered an approach. They were submerged, creeping toward the enemy destroyers. The plan was to close the distance and unleash a spread of torpedoes. But the reality of war is rarely as clean as the manuals suggest. The Japanese destroyers were shelling the island, their guns flashing in the darkening sky. The Argonaut struggled to maneuver into a firing position. Her sheer size made her sluggish in the shallow waters. The captain tried to set up the shot, but the destroyers were moving fast, their erratic courses making a torpedo solution difficult. The Argonaut was a heavyweight boxer trying to catch a fly. As they maneuvered, one of the Japanese destroyers turned. Had they been spotted? The tension in the control room was suffocating. Every creak of the hull sounded like a gunshot. The Argonaut was designed to lay mines and fight on the surface with deck guns, not to engage in a cat-and-mouse game with high-speed destroyers in shallow water. They could hear the explosions of the shells hitting Midway. The ground crew on the island was taking a beating. The Argonaut wanted to fight. The crew wanted to strike back for Pearl Harbor. But the tactical situation was falling apart. The massive submarine could not get a clear shot without exposing herself to immediate destruction. The Japanese destroyers, having completed their bombardment, turned and sped away into the night. It was a frustrating, bitter beginning. The Argonaut had been within sight of the enemy on the first day of the war, yet she had been unable to draw blood. This encounter highlighted the stark reality that the Argonaut faced. She was a pre-war concept, fighting a modern war. She was built for a slower, more deliberate style of combat that no longer existed. The Japanese Navy was fast, aggressive, and technologically advanced. The Argonaut was a relic from the 1920s, trying to survive in the 1940s. Following the attack, the Argonaut was recalled to Pearl Harbor. The return journey was a somber one. As they pulled into the harbor, the crew witnessed the devastation firsthand. The twisted metal of the battleships, the smoke still rising from the oil fires, the sense of shock that hung over the base. It was a grim awakening. The Argonaut was painted in dark wartime camouflage. Her bright peacetime colors were gone. She was stripped of non-essential gear. The war was real, and the Argonaut was going to be thrown into the thick of it. But the Navy was unsure what to do with her. She was too big for standard patrols, too valuable to risk on suicide missions, yet too armed to leave in port. She was classified as a mine-laying submarine, designation SM-1. Her first true war patrol would utilize this capability. In January of 1942, she was ordered to patrol the approaches to the Trident Strait. The mission was dangerous. She was to venture into Japanese-controlled waters, operating alone, with the constant threat of enemy aircraft and anti-submarine vessels. During this first patrol, the Argonaut's mechanical demons began to surface. The electrical systems, corroded by the salt air and the humidity of the tropics, began to fail. The engines required constant maintenance. The crew worked in shifts, stripping down machinery and rebuilding it while submerged, sweating in the stifling heat of the tropical ocean. It was a testament to the skill of the American submariner. They kept the giant running through sheer force of will. The patrol was not without action. The Argonaut encountered enemy shipping, but her torpedoes, the Mark 14 steam torpedoes, were notoriously unreliable in the early stages of the war. They ran too deep, they exploded prematurely, or they failed to detonate upon impact. It was a curse that plagued the entire submarine force, but for a boat as large and vulnerable as the Argonaut, a failed torpedo meant she had exposed her position for nothing. On one occasion, she spotted a Japanese freighter. The setup was perfect. The Argonaut fired. The crew waited for the explosion, the sound of tearing metal, but there was nothing. Silence. The torpedo had missed or malfunctioned. The freighter sailed on, oblivious to the death that had passed beneath its keel. The frustration among the crew was growing. They were risking their lives in a submarine that was hard to hide, firing weapons that didn't work. Despite these failures, the Argonaut's presence was vital. She was a threat that the Japanese had to respect. Her long range allowed her to operate in areas where the enemy felt safe. She was a ghost in their backyard. But the commanders back at Pearl Harbor had a different idea for the giant. The war in the Pacific was shifting. The Marines were preparing for the offensive. They needed to move specialized troops to islands held by the Japanese. They needed a transport that could slip in unseen, deploy a raiding party, and extract them. Standard submarines were too small, cramped with torpedoes and machinery. Surface ships were too visible. But the Argonaut? The Argonaut was cavernous. She had the space, and so a decision was made that would alter her destiny. The mine-laying gear would be removed. The torpedo rooms would be reconfigured. The giant mine layer was about to be transformed into an underwater troop transport. She was going to become a carrier of the Marine Raiders. This transformation marked the end of the first chapter of the Argonaut's War. She had survived the initial shock. She had patrolled the dangerous waters. She had proven that despite her age and her size, she could operate in the war zone. But the next phase of her life would demand even more. It would require her to carry the elite warriors of the Marine Corps into one of the most daring raids of the Second World War. The giant was evolving. She was no longer just a hunter. She was becoming a chariot for the vanguard of the American offensive. As the Argonaut sat in the dry dock at Mare Island, undergoing her conversion, the welders' torches sparking in the night, she looked less like a machine of war and more like a scarred veteran preparing for one last great effort. The heavy mine-laying tubes were cut away. Bunks were installed. The internal geography of the ship was rewritten. She was being prepared for the Makin Island raid. The crew looked at their ship with a mixture of pride and apprehension. They knew her quirks. They knew how she groaned when she dived deep. They knew how the hull plates compressed under pressure. They loved her, but they also feared her. They knew that in the deep ocean there is no mercy for the slow. And the Argonaut was very, very slow. As she prepared to leave the shipyard, reborn as a transport submarine, the Pacific War was entering a new, bloodier phase. The initial Japanese expansion had been halted at Midway, but the enemy was dug in. They held the islands. They controlled the air. The Argonaut was sailing into a hornet's nest. The men aboard her, both the sailors and the Marines who would soon join them, were about to embark on a mission that would become the stuff of legend. But for now, the Argonaut waited, a silent giant of steel and resolve, ready to carry the fight to the enemy's shore. The transformation of the USS Argonaut was an act of desperation born of necessity. In the summer of 1942, the United States was still back-footed, reeling from the loss of the Philippines and the brutal fighting in the Solomons. The Navy needed a victory, a strike that would boost morale and prove that American forces could touch the Japanese anywhere in the Pacific. The target selected was Makin Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. It was a small, fortified outpost, far from the front lines, a pinprick on the map. But to get there, the Navy needed a delivery system that could carry over 200 elite warriors thousands of miles undetected. They turned to the two largest submarines in the fleet, the USS Nautilus and the USS Argonaut. In early August 1942, the docks at Pearl Harbor witnessed a collision of two very different worlds. The silent, methodical culture of the submarine service met the raucous, aggressive energy of the United States Marine Corps. Companies A and B of the 2nd Raider Battalion, led by the charismatic Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, marched down the pier. Among them was Major James Roosevelt, the eldest son of the President of the United States. These men were pioneers of a new kind of warfare, trained in guerrilla tactics, knife fighting, and night raids. They called themselves gung-ho, a Chinese phrase meaning work together. But as they stared at the dark, oil-stained hull of the Argonaut, many of them wondered how they would all fit inside. The Argonaut was big, but she was not a luxury liner. She was designed for a crew of about 80 men. Now, she was loading over 120 Marines, along with their weapons, ammunition, rubber boats, and supplies. The logistical reality was a nightmare. Every inch of space was claimed. Torpedoes were removed to make room for bunks. The air conditioning system, already struggling in the tropical heat, was pushed to its absolute breaking point. The moment the hatches were sealed and the Argonaut slipped away from the pier, the atmosphere inside became thick, hot, and suffocating. The voyage to Makin was an ordeal of endurance. For the submarine crew, it was a test of patience. Their organized, quiet world was invaded by Marines sharpening knives, cleaning Thompson submachine guns, and trying to find space to sleep on the steel decks. For the Marines, it was a test of sanity. They were used to the open air, the jungle, the mud. Now they were trapped in a steel tube, submerged for most of the day to avoid enemy aircraft, breathing recycled air that smelled of diesel oil, unwashed bodies, and cooking cabbage. The temperature inside the boat often soared above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Sweat dripped from the overhead pipes. Condensation slicked the bulkheads. The air grew heavy with carbon dioxide, making men lethargic and irritable. Yet, a strange bond formed in that crushing heat. The sailors shared their limited water. The Marines shared their stories. They were heading into the unknown together. The Argonaut, groaning under the extra weight, plowed through the Pacific swells. She was heavy, sluggish, and diving took even longer than usual. But she kept moving. She was the whale carrying Jonah, moving relentlessly toward the enemy. On the morning of August 16th, the Argonaut and the Nautilus arrived off Makin Atoll. The tension in the control room was electric. The captain raised the periscope, slicing through the calm surface of the water. Through the glass, he could see the palm trees swaying in the breeze, the white sandy beaches, and the unsuspecting Japanese garrison. It looked like paradise, but they were about to turn it into hell. The plan was to surface at night, launch the Marines in their rubber boats, and wait while they raided the island. It sounded simple on paper, but the ocean rarely respects plans. As night fell, the weather turned. The wind picked up, whipping the sea into a frenzy. Rain began to lash the surface, hiding the moon, but also churning the waves. The Argonaut surfaced, her ballast tanks blowing with a deafening roar. The hatches were thrown open, and the sweet, fresh air rushed into the stale submarine, followed immediately by the spray of salt water. The Marines scrambled up the ladders, hauling their heavy rubber boats onto the wet, slippery deck. It was chaos. The submarine was rolling heavily in the swell. The Marines, many of whom were seasick from the long voyage, struggled to inflate their boats and secure their gear. The roar of the ocean drowned out commands. Engines refused to start. Boats were swamped. But Carlson's raiders were elite for a reason. Through sheer force of will, they launched their small craft into the black, heaving water and began the long paddle toward the shore. The Argonaut watched them go, her silhouette low in the water, a silent guardian in the storm. As dawn broke on August 17th, the element of surprise was lost. A sniper's shot rang out on the island, followed by the chatter of machine guns. The raid had begun. The Argonaut and Nautilus submerged, waiting for the signal to assist. And then it came. The raiders were pinned down near the beach. They needed fire support. They needed the heavy hitters. This was the moment the Argonaut had been built for. She was not just a transport. She was a cruiser submarine. The order was given. Battle stations surface. The klaxon blared, a sound that sent adrenaline spiking through the veins of every man on board. The giant submarine broke the surface, the water cascading off her massive deck. The gun crews, trained for this exact second, scrambled out of the hatches and raced to the two 6-inch guns mounted on the deck. These were massive weapons for a submarine capable of hurling a 100-pound shell over 10 miles. The target was a Japanese transport ship and a patrol boat located in the lagoon, threatening the Marines on the shore. The gunnery officer barked coordinates. The massive barrels elevated. "Fire!" The Argonaut shuddered violently as the first shell screamed from the barrel. The noise was earth-shattering, a thunderclap that rolled across the water. The smell of cordite instantly filled the air, sharp and acrid. The crew reloaded with practiced rhythm. Shell, powder, ram, fire. The Argonaut and Nautilus unleashed a barrage of destruction. The Japanese patrol boat didn't stand a chance. Shells tore through its hull, sending plumes of water and metal into the sky. Within minutes, the enemy vessels were burning wrecks, sinking into the turquoise waters of the lagoon. The Argonaut had drawn blood with her guns, proving that the old concept of the submarine cruiser still had teeth. But the victory at sea did not mean safety. The Japanese responded with air power. The shout of "aircraft" forced the Argonaut to crash dive. The gun crews abandoned their weapons and threw themselves down the hatches. The vents opened, and the ocean rushed into the ballast tanks. The Argonaut, heavy and slow, tilted downward, fighting to get under the safety of the water before the bombs fell. For the rest of the day, the crew of the Argonaut lived in a state of suspended terror. They could hear the battle raging on the island through the hull. They could hear the muffled thumps of aerial bombs exploding in the water above them. They were blind, waiting for word from the Marines. The heat inside the boat began to climb again. The air grew stale. They were trapped in a steel coffin, listening to the war happening just a few 100 feet away. As night fell again, the extraction began. This was where the operation unraveled into a nightmare. The surf at the beach had grown violent. The exhausted Marines, having fought all day in the jungle heat, tried to launch their rubber boats through the breaking waves. Time and again, they were flipped over, their weapons lost, their bodies battered against the sand. They could not get off the island. On the Argonaut, the crew waited anxiously at the rendezvous point. They surfaced in the darkness, scanning the waves for the small rubber boats. Hours passed. Nothing. The captain knew that every minute they stayed on the surface was a gamble with death. Japanese aircraft were hunting them. Reinforcements were surely on the way, but they could not leave their brothers behind. Finally, a few boats appeared out of the gloom. The Marines who climbed aboard were shadows of the men who had left. Their uniforms were torn, soaked in blood and seawater. They were trembling with exhaustion. They collapsed on the steel decks, too tired to speak. But most of the raiders were still trapped on the island. The situation was critical. Colonel Carlson, realizing they could not break through the surf, made the agonizing decision to remain on the island for another day. The Argonaut and Nautilus had to withdraw to deep water to recharge their batteries and avoid the inevitable morning air patrols. They had to leave the Marines alone on the hostile shore. It was a heavy burden for the submarine crews. The thought of abandoning the raiders gnawed at them. The next day was a tense game of cat and mouse. The submarines lurked offshore, while on the island the raiders fought for their lives, hunting down the last of the Japanese garrison. Finally, on the night of August 18th, the surf subsided enough. The remaining Marines lashed their rubber boats to the sides of the submarine's remaining boats and were towed out to the waiting Leviathans. The scene on the deck of the Argonaut that night was one of chaotic relief. Men were hauled out of the water, half-drowned and delirious. The wounded were carried carefully down the narrow hatches. The smell of antiseptic and blood mixed with the pervading stench of diesel. The boat was dangerously overcrowded now, filled with wounded men, discarded gear, and the sheer emotional weight of the battle. When the last Marine was accounted for, the Argonaut turned her bow toward Pearl Harbor. She was battered. Her engines were complaining, her crew was exhausted, and her supplies were nearly gone. But she had done it. She had carried the war to the enemy's doorstep and brought the warriors home. The return trip was a blur of medical emergencies and mechanical triage. The Navy doctors and corpsmen worked around the clock in the makeshift sick bay, tending to gunshot wounds and tropical infections. The submarine, usually a place of strict discipline, became a floating hospital ward. The bond between the crew and the raiders was cemented forever. They had shared the terror of the deep and the fire of the surface. When the Argonaut finally limped back into Pearl Harbor, she was greeted as a hero. The raid was hailed as a great success, a morale booster that the American public desperately needed. The press celebrated the Carlson's raiders and the mysterious submarines that had carried them. But the Argonaut paid a price for her glory. The strain of the mission had revealed the structural and mechanical limits of the aging giant. Her engines were shot. Her hull was fatigued. She was a warrior that had been pushed beyond her design limits. The Navy command looked at the Argonaut and saw a dilemma. She had proven useful, yes, but she was also a liability. She was too slow for the evolving speed of the Pacific War. The destroyers were getting faster, the planes were getting deadlier, and anti-submarine technology was advancing rapidly. The Argonaut was a dinosaur in a world of sharks. While the crew went on shore leave to drink away the memories of the cramped, sweating dark, the brass made a decision. The Argonaut would not be retired. She would not be sent to the Atlantic for convoy duty. She was needed in the Pacific, but she needed to be fixed. She was ordered to undergo a massive overhaul. She would receive new engines, new electronics, and a new coat of paint. She was being prepared for her next chapter, a chapter that would take her away from the transport role and back to her roots as a combat submarine. But as the welders began to cut into her hull for the refit, a sense of foreboding hung over the ship. The men who sailed her loved her, but they knew the truth. They knew that in the next patrol there would be no Marines to storm the beaches. There would be no surprise raids. It would just be the Argonaut, alone in the vast ocean, hunting enemy ships while trying to hide her massive bulk from the hunters that were searching for her. The giant had survived the raid, but the war was far from over. And the ocean is a patient executioner. The refit would take months, months of noise, sparks, and bureaucracy. But for the Argonaut, it was merely a pause, a deep breath before the final plunge. She was getting ready to sail into the year 1943, a year that would bring new technology, new tactics, and a tragic destiny that was already written in the stars, waiting for her in the cold waters off of New Britain. The Argonaut was about to face her final test. The glory of the Makin Raid faded quickly into the harsh reality of logistics. The USS Argonaut had returned a hero, her hull battered and her crew exhausted, but the adrenaline of the mission could not mask the fundamental truth that plagued her existence. She was dying from the inside out. The massive Mayan diesel engines, the beating heart of this underwater city, were failing. They had vibrated, coughed, and rattled their way across thousands of miles of ocean, but they were finished. The Navy engineers who inspected her at Pearl Harbor saw a ship that was structurally sound, but mechanically geriatric. If the Argonaut was to fight again, she needed more than a tune-up. She needed a resurrection. In the autumn of 1942, while the war in the Pacific raged on with brutal intensity around Guadalcanal, the Argonaut was ordered to steam east, away from the fighting. She was heading back to the mainland, to the Mare Island Navy Yard in California. For the crew, this was a surreal reprieve. They were leaving the combat zone, sailing toward the lights and safety of the American coast. But the mood was not entirely celebratory. They knew that they were only going back to make their ship deadlier, so they could return to the very waters that tried to kill them. Upon arrival at Mare Island, the Argonaut was stripped of her dignity. She was hauled into a dry dock, the water drained away to reveal the immense barnacle-encrusted expanse of her hull. Workers swarmed over her like ants on a carcass. The primary objective of this overhaul was a heart transplant. The troublesome German-designed engines were to be cut out and replaced. In their place, the Navy installed 4 General Motors Winton diesel engines. These were the workhorses of the fleet, more reliable, more efficient, and smoother than the rattling beasts they replaced. But this was not a simple swap. It was major industrial surgery. The pressure hull had to be cut open. Massive cranes lifted the old engines out, swinging tons of obsolete steel through the air, and lowered the new machinery into the bowels of the ship. The interior of the Argonaut became a cacophony of grinding metal, welding torches, and shouting men. The smell of burning steel replaced the smell of diesel. For weeks, she was not a ship. She was a construction site. Along with the engines, the Argonaut received the eyes of a modern killer. The engineers installed the latest radar systems. The SJ Surface Search Radar would allow her to spot enemy ships in total darkness or heavy fog, visualizing targets as blips of green light on a cathode ray tube. The SD Air Search Radar would give her early warning of approaching aircraft, theoretically buying her precious seconds to dive before the bombs began to fall. She was being transformed from a blind brawler into a technologically advanced hunter. Yet, despite the new engines and the new electronics, the fundamental flaw of the Argonaut remained. You could change the heart, but you could not change the bones. She was still massive. She still displaced over 4,000 tons submerged. She still handled like a freight train in a drift. The laws of hydrodynamics were unforgiving. The new engines provided better reliability, but they could not make her nimble. Her diving time was improved slightly by drilling more flood ports in the superstructure to allow air to escape faster. But she was still dangerously slow compared to the newer Gato-class fleet submarines that were now entering the war. She was a modernized relic, a dreadnought in a world of destroyers. By December of 1942, the work was done. The Argonaut slipped back into the water, looking fresh and dangerous. Her hull was painted in the dark, non-reflective camouflage measures of the late war period. The crew, a mix of seasoned veterans from the Makin Raid and fresh-faced sailors straight from training schools, began the process of learning their new ship. They ran drills, testing the new engines, calibrating the radar, and firing the 6-inch guns. The vibration was gone, replaced by the steady, powerful thrum of American engineering. She felt stronger. She felt ready. The orders came down swiftly. The Argonaut was not to remain in the safety of American waters. She was assigned to the Southwest Pacific area, under the command of the 7th Fleet based in Brisbane, Australia. The war had shifted south. The Japanese were fortifying their positions in the Bismarck archipelago, turning the island of New Britain and its harbour, Rabaul, into an impregnable fortress. They were shipping thousands of tons of supplies and troops through the corridors of the Solomon Sea. The Navy needed submarines to cut those jagged arteries of supply. They needed the Argonaut to go into the lion's den. The transit across the Pacific was a long, lonely voyage. As the Argonaut crossed the equator, the crew engaged in the traditional, raucous ceremony of crossing the line, momentarily forgetting the war to initiate the polywogs into the domain of King Neptune. But as the coast of Australia appeared on the horizon, the laughter died down. Brisbane was a bustle of wartime activity. American and Australian uniforms mixed in the streets. The harbour was filled with transports, destroyers, and the grey shapes of other submarines. Here, the Argonaut received her final briefing. She was to patrol the approaches to Rabaul, specifically the area between New Britain and New Ireland. This was known as St. George's Channel. It was a choke point, a funnel through which Japanese convoys had to pass to reinforce their garrisons in New Guinea and the Solomons. It was also one of the most dangerous bodies of water on Earth. The Japanese knew its importance. They patrolled it with destroyers, sub-chasers, and aircraft from the nearby airfields. To send a submarine into St. George's Channel was to send a burglar into a house where the owner is awake and holding a shotgun. The command of the Argonaut had passed to Lieutenant Commander John Pierce. He was a capable officer, serious and focused. He knew the limitations of his boat. He knew that he could not dance with destroyers. His strategy had to be one of stealth and ambush. Use the radar to find the targets at night, fire a spread of torpedoes, and then use the deep water to hide. The Argonaut was now strictly a hunter-killer. The mine-laying gear was gone. The troop transport bunks were gone. She was filled with torpedoes, the Mark 14 steam torpedoes that had caused so much heartbreak in the early war. The crew prayed that the magnetic exploders had been fixed, that the depth settings were true. There is nothing more demoralizing to a submariner than doing everything right, only to hear the dull thud of a dud torpedo bouncing off a target's hull. On January 2nd, 1943, the USS Argonaut cast off her lines from the pier in Brisbane. The sun was blazing down, the humidity thick and oppressive. A few sailors stood on the deck, watching the city recede. They wrote their last letters home, leaving them with the postal clerk on the tender. "Don't worry about me, Mom. The boat runs great now. We'll be back before you know it." Standard lines to comfort those left behind. As the submarine passed the anti-submarine nets and entered the open ocean, the order was given to rig for dive. The vents opened, and the Argonaut slipped beneath the waves, beginning her third war patrol. The journey north to the patrol area was tense. As they moved closer to the equator, the heat inside the boat began to build. The air conditioning system struggled against the tropical water temperatures. The crew moved with efficient lethargy, conserving energy. The routine of life aboard a submarine took over. 4 hours on watch, 8 hours off. Sleep, eat, stand watch, drill. The radar operators stared into their glowing green screens until their eyes burned, searching for the telltale pip of an enemy plane or a periscope. By January 10th, the Argonaut was in position. She was lurking south of St. George's Channel. The water here was deep, the currents unpredictable. The hydrophones, the underwater ears of the submarine, picked up the sounds of the biological ocean, the clicking of shrimp, the songs of whales. But the sonar operators were listening for something else. They were listening for the rhythmic screw beats of Japanese merchant ships. The Japanese were running convoys with increasing desperation. They were losing the war of attrition in Guadalcanal, and they needed to push supplies through. Intelligence reports indicated that a major convoy was expected to leave Rabaul, heading for Leh. The Argonaut was positioned to intercept. The atmosphere in the control room was heavy with anticipation. Lieutenant Commander Pierce studied the charts. He knew the geography of the ocean floor, the thermal layers that could hide his submarine from sonar, and the likely routes of the enemy. He was playing a three-dimensional game of chess against an opponent he could not see. On the night of January 9th, the radar picked up a contact, a small vessel, likely a patrol boat. Pierce decided not to engage. His torpedoes were precious. He was saving them for the fat transports, the ships carrying tanks and ammunition. He let the small fish go, staying deep, remaining a shadow. The discipline of the crew was absolute. They moved through the boat in socks to minimize noise. Every dropped wrench, every slammed hatch could be heard by a destroyer's hydrophone miles away. Silence was their armor. As the dawn of January 10th approached, the Argonaut surfaced to recharge her batteries. The fresh air was a blessing, but the surface was the danger zone. Lookouts scanned the horizon with binoculars, their necks straining. The sky was clear, the visibility almost too good. If a Japanese patrol plane spotted them now in the daylight, they would be in a fight for their lives. The massive silhouette of the Argonaut was hard to miss. Suddenly, the radar operator shouted, "Contact! Bearing 040! Range 15,000 yards!" Pierce rushed to the bridge. Through his binoculars, he saw smoke on the horizon. It was a convoy. 5 merchant ships, heavily laden, plodding through the swell. But flanking them were the jagged shapes of destroyers, the escorts, the sheepdogs guarding the flock. This was it. The target they had sailed thousands of miles to find. The Argonaut was in a perfect position, ahead of the convoy's track. If they submerged now and waited, the enemy ships would sail right into their crosshairs. It was a textbook setup. "Clear the bridge! Dive! Dive!" Pierce's voice boomed. The diving alarm klaxon screamed, "Ah, ooga! Ah, ooga!" The lookouts dropped down the hatch, sliding down the ladders. The main induction valve slammed shut with a metallic clang. The vents opened, roaring, as the air escaped, and the sea rushed in. The bow of the Argonaut pitched down. But she was slow. Even with the refit, even with the new flood ports, the Argonaut took nearly 60 seconds to get under. For a minute, she was a helpless steel whale wallowing in the surf. The destroyers on the horizon were closing the distance. Had they seen her? Had the glint of sunlight on the periscope shears given her away? Inside the boat, the angle was steep. Men held onto the railings, their knuckles white. The depth gauge needle began to move. 50 feet. 60 feet. 80 feet. "Level off at periscope depth," Pierce ordered. The boat groaned as she leveled out. The electric motors hummed quietly. They were under. They were invisible. Pierce raised the periscope slowly, just a few inches of steel breaking the surface. He peered through the lens. The convoy was closer now. He could see the rust on the hulls of the transports. He could see the wake of the destroyers. They were zigzagging, a defensive measure to throw off aim, but they were coming right for him. He calculated the speed, the range, the angle on the bow. He was setting up a shot on the lead transport. "Stand by torpedo tubes 1, 2, and 3, he whispered. "Open outer doors." "Gardig." The torpedo men in the forward room moved with practiced speed. The outer doors swung open, exposing the tubes to the sea. The firing circuits were closed. The Argonaut was a loaded gun, pointed at the heart of the Japanese formation. But, as Pierce watched, one of the destroyers suddenly changed course. It turned sharply, its bow cutting a white wave through the blue water. It was heading directly toward the spot where the Argonaut lurked. The sonar operator called out, "High-speed screws! Bearing changing fast! He's coming in!" The Japanese destroyer, the Isokaze, had spotted the periscope feather or picked up a sonar contact. The hunter was about to become the hunted. Pierce had a split-second decision to make. Fire the torpedoes now at the transport and reveal his position completely, or go deep and try to evade the depth charges that were inevitably coming. The moment hung in the balance. The giant submarine, crowded with men, weapons, and fuel, hovered in the silent deep. Above them, the destroyers were accelerating, their engines churning the water into a frothy violence. The Argonaut was about to enter the crucible. The refit, the new engines, the radar, none of it mattered now. All that mattered was the skill of the crew and the strength of the steel. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was about to begin for the USS Argonaut, and the odds were stacking against her. The ocean floor is a quiet place, but the space between the surface and the deep is a chaotic arena of physics and violence. Inside the USS Argonaut, the silence was absolute, a held breath shared by 102 men. The only sound was the hum of the electric motors and the terrifying rhythmic pinging of the enemy sonar striking the hull. It sounded like a handful of gravel thrown against a metal bucket. A sound that every submariner dreads, because it means the cloak of invisibility has been stripped away. Lieutenant Commander Pierce stood at the periscope, his hands gripping the handles white-knuckled. The Japanese destroyer was charging, a bone in its teeth, closing the distance at 30 knots. This was the moment of truth. The hunter had been spotted, and now the prey was turning to bite. Pierce made a split-second calculation. To turn and run was suicide. The Argonaut was too slow. To dive deep immediately was risky. The destroyer was already on top of them. The only option was to strike first. He aligned the crosshairs on the oncoming destroyer. It was a down-the-throat shot, the most dangerous maneuver in submarine warfare. You are firing at a narrow profile, a knife edge of steel coming straight at you. If you miss, the enemy will be over you in seconds, dropping depth charges directly onto your con. "Fire one!" Pierce shouted. The boat shuddered as the compressed air kicked the torpedo out of the tube. "Fire two! Fire three!" 3 Mark 14 torpedoes streaked through the water, leaving a visible trail of bubbles. The crew held their breath, counting the seconds. 1001, 1002. The sonar operator, headphones pressed to his ears, listened for the high-pitched whine of the torpedo screws. On the surface, the Japanese captain saw the wakes. He barked orders to the helm. The destroyer heeled over sharply, carving a desperate turn to comb the tracks. One torpedo missed, passing harmlessly by the destroyer's stern. The second missed, but the third found its mark. A dull, heavy thud resonated through the hull of the Argonaut, followed by the sound of twisting metal. A cheer erupted in the control room, a release of tension that had been building for weeks. They had hit back. They had drawn blood. But the celebration was premature. The hit had damaged the destroyer, but it had not killed it. And now, the rest of the pack was alerted. The ocean surface above them erupted into chaos. The damaged destroyer, smoking but still lethal, was joined by its sister ships, the Maikaze and the Isokaze. They were modern, fast, and commanded by men who knew exactly how to kill a submarine. They began to circle the area, weaving a web of sonar pulses. The Argonaut was no longer hunting. She was running for her life. "Take her deep!" 300 feet! "Rig for silent running," Pierce ordered. The plainsmen pushed their yokes forward. The Argonaut tilted her nose down, seeking the crushing darkness of the depths, where the thermal layers might hide her. But she was heavy. She was slow to respond. As she descended, the first depth charges splashed into the water above. To a sailor on a surface ship, a depth charge is a splash and a distant boom. To a man inside a submarine, it is the sound of the apocalypse. The charges are drums of high explosive, set to detonate at a specific pressure. When they explode, they create a shock wave that travels through the water faster than the speed of sound. It hits the submarine hull like a physical hammer blow. The first pattern exploded shallow, above the Argonaut. The boat shook violently. Dust and cork insulation rained down from the overhead pipes, filling the air with a choking haze. Light bulbs popped in their sockets, plunging the compartments into darkness. The emergency lights flickered on, casting a dim, red glow over the terrified faces of the crew. Men grabbed onto valves, bunks, anything bolted down, as the floor beneath them bucked and heaved. "Report damage!" Pierce yelled over the ringing in his ears. "Minor leaks in the forward torpedo room. Hydraulic lines ruptured," came the reply. They were still diving, but the Japanese destroyers were relentless. They had a lock. They could hear the Argonaut. the pinging of the active sonar increased in tempo, becoming a continuous, maddening shriek. The destroyers were coordinating their attacks. One would listen while the other made a run. It was a methodical execution. Another string of depth charges rained down. This time, they were closer. Much closer. The explosions were deafening, a series of thunderclaps that felt like they were inside the skull of every man on board. The Argonaut was tossed sideways. The pressure hull groaned, a high-pitched screech of metal being compressed beyond its limits. Rivets popped like gunshots, shooting across the room and ricocheting off the bulkheads. Water began to spray into the control room from a cracked flange, a high-pressure jet that cut like a knife. The Argonaut was a big target. In the shallow waters of the Solomon Sea, she had nowhere to hide. Her size, once a source of pride, was now her death sentence. She reflected sonar waves like a barn door. The Japanese commanders above knew exactly where she was. They were bracketing her, walking the explosions closer and closer to the hull. In the maneuvering room, the heat was unbearable. The electricians watched the gauges with horror. The batteries were taking a beating from the shock waves. If the battery casings cracked, and the acid mixed with the seawater in the bilges, it would create chlorine gas, a deadly yellow-green fog that would kill everyone in minutes. The air was already foul, thick with the smell of ozone, burning rubber, and fear. The boat was losing trim. The bow was heavy. She was sliding deeper, past her test depth. 350 feet. 400 feet. The hull plates were compressing. If they went any deeper, the ocean would crush them like a tin can. Pierce had to make a decision. The Argonaut was wounded. Her propulsion was failing. Her rudder was jammed. If they stayed down, they would die in the dark, crushed by the pressure or suffocated by the lack of air. If they surfaced, they would face the guns of 3 destroyers. It is a choice no commander wants to make, but it is the choice that war forces upon them. To die passively or to die fighting. Pierce looked at his men. They were young, scared, but they were at their stations. They were waiting for his word. "Blow all main ballast," Pierce ordered. "Surface! Surface! Surface!" The order was relayed. The chief of the boat pulled the emergency handles. High-pressure air roared into the ballast tanks, forcing the water out. The Argonaut, heavy and broken, stopped her descent. She hung for a moment in the black void, and then, slowly, agonizingly, she began to rise. The ascent was uncontrolled. The boat porpoised, the bow angling up sharply. Inside, men were thrown against the aft bulkheads. Tools and loose gear slid down the deck, crashing into the rear of the compartments. They were rocketing toward the surface. Above the water, the drama was being witnessed by an unexpected audience. A flight of American B-25 Mitchell bombers, returning from a raid on Rabaul, was flying low over the water. The pilots looked down and saw a disturbance in the ocean. A massive shape broke the surface, surrounded by white foam. It was the Argonaut. She erupted from the sea at a steep angle, her bow pointing toward the sky like a breaching whale, before crashing back down with a tremendous splash. The moment the Argonaut broke the surface, the Japanese destroyers opened fire. This was not a battle. It was an execution. The Argonaut was a sitting duck, wallowing in the swells, her engines struggling to gain traction. She was surrounded on 3 sides. The destroyers Isokaze and Makaze were less than 2,000 yards away. The first shells hit the Argonaut before the crew could even open the hatch to the bridge. 5-inch high explosive rounds slammed into the superstructure. The conning tower, the brain of the submarine, was smashed. Steel shrapnel swept the decks. The 6-inch guns of the Argonaut, the weapons that were supposed to make her a cruiser, were useless. There was no time to man them. There was no time to aim. Inside the pressure hull, the noise was indescribable. It was the sound of a sledgehammer hitting a hollow drum, magnified 1,000 times. Shells were piercing the non-pressure hull, tearing apart the ballast tanks, ripping through the airlines. The boat was listing heavily to port. Smoke began to fill the compartments. The order to abandon ship was never given, or if it was never heard over the roar of the incoming fire. From the air, the American bomber crews watched in horror. They saw the black shape of the submarine, the white star of the U.S. Navy visible on her deck, being torn apart by the converging fire of the Japanese ships. They saw geysers of water erupting around her as shells missed, and the bright orange flashes as shells hit home. One of the B-25 pilots banked his plane, trying to make a strafing run on the destroyers, trying to distract them, to give his brothers in the water a chance. But his machine guns were gnats biting at elephants. The destroyers ignored the plane and poured their fire into the dying submarine. The Argonaut was fighting to stay afloat. The pumps were screaming, trying to push the water out, but the ocean was coming in through a dozen jagged holes. The bow began to slip under. The stern rose into the air, the propellers still spinning slowly, biting at the empty air. Inside the forward torpedo room, the water was rising fast. The men were trapped. The watertight doors were sealed to prevent the flooding from spreading, locking them in their doom. In the control room, the water was waist-deep. The lights were gone. The air was toxic. Lieutenant Commander Pierce, clinging to the periscope stand, knew it was over. There was no escape. There was no rescue. There was only the end. The Japanese destroyers ceased fire. They didn't need to waste any more ammunition. The target was finished. The Argonaut, the giant of the fleet, the pride of the Navy, paused for a moment, half submerged, a broken island of steel in a vast, indifferent ocean, and then, with a terrible groan of escaping air and buckling metal, she slid backward. She did not go quietly. As the water rushed into the battery compartment, the mixture of acid and salt water created a final massive explosion. Or perhaps it was the magazine for the deck guns detonating. A huge column of water and debris shot into the sky. The bow rearing up one last time, as if gasping for air, before the ocean claimed her. The surface of the water churned and boiled. Oil slicked the waves, a black shroud spreading over the grave. Debris bobbed in the foam, a life jacket, a wooden crate, a patch of cork. But there were no survivors. Not one man escaped the steel tomb. 102 souls, sailors, officers, fathers, sons, were pulled down into the crushing dark of the St. George's Channel. The destroyers turned and sped away, leaving only the circling American bombers to witness the vanishing of the largest submarine in the United States Navy. The circle of iron had closed, and the Argonaut was gone. The smoke cleared over St. George's Channel, carried away by the indifferent trade winds of the Pacific. The surface of the ocean, which had been torn apart by high explosives and churning propellers, slowly returned to its rhythmic, rolling calm. The Japanese destroyers, having confirmed their kill, did not linger. They reformed their defensive perimeter around the convoy and continued their march toward Leh, leaving behind only a patch of oil and the echoes of a massacre. For the pilots of the American B-25 bombers circling overhead, the scene was a gut-wrenching tableau of helplessness. They had witnessed the death of a giant. They had seen the white star on the black hull, the desperate angle of the bow, and the final fatal plunge. They turned their aircraft back toward their base in New Guinea, carrying a heavy burden of silence. They were the bearers of the first grim tidings that the USS Argonaut was no more. When a submarine is lost, the silence is not immediate. At naval headquarters in Brisbane and Pearl Harbor, the Argonaut was simply a pin on a map, a unit expected to report in at scheduled intervals. Days passed. The radio operators listened to the designated frequencies, straining to hear the specific Morse code signature of the Argonaut. They waited for a weather report, a contact report, or a simple check-in. But the frequencies remained empty. The static of the atmosphere was the only answer. In the submarine service, there is a specific haunting phrase used for this period of uncertainty: overdue, presumed lost. It is a slow-motion realization of tragedy. It begins with anxiety, moves to dread, and settles into a cold, hard acceptance. For the families of the 102 men aboard the Argonaut, the war was a distant, frightening abstract until the telegrams arrived. These yellow slips of paper, delivered by Western Union messengers, shattered lives in living rooms across America. The Argonaut carried the largest crew of any American submarine during the war. Her loss was not just a tactical defeat. It was a mass casualty event for the tight-knit submarine community. 102 fathers, sons, and brothers had vanished without a trace, with no graves to visit, no bodies to bury. The official announcement from the Navy Department was brief and stoic, hiding the violent reality of her end. It simply stated that the USS Argonaut had failed to return from patrol. But the details, pieced together later from Japanese war records and the reports of the Army Air Force pilots, painted a picture of a desperate final stand. The Argonaut had not been caught napping. She had gone down fighting. She had fired her torpedoes. She had damaged the enemy. She had faced 3 modern destroyers in a slow, obsolete boat, and had refused to yield until the ocean itself claimed her. The loss of the Argonaut forced a reckoning within the United States Navy. She was the last of the V-boats to be lost, and her destruction hammered the final nail into the coffin of the cruiser submarine concept. The dream of the 1920s, of a massive gun-toting submarine that could stand toe-to-toe with surface ships, was proven dead. The war had changed. Speed, stealth, and rapid diving capabilities were the new currencies of survival. The Argonaut, with her 6-inch guns and her lumbering bulk, was a knight in plate armor trying to fight on a modern battlefield dominated by machine guns. She was a magnificent anachronism, a ship built for a style of warfare that had ceased to exist the moment the first airplane dropped a depth charge. However, to dismiss the Argonaut simply as a failure of design would be a disservice to her legacy. She was a pioneer. She proved that a submarine could be more than just a torpedo shooter. Her conversion into a troop transport for the Makin Island raid was a visionary moment that foreshadowed the future of naval warfare. In 1942, she showed that a submarine could project power ashore, inserting special operations forces deep behind enemy lines. This concept would lie dormant for decades until it was resurrected in the Cold War and the modern era. Today, the Ohio-class guided missile submarines, converted to carry Navy SEALs and their delivery vehicles, are the spiritual descendants of the USS Argonaut. She was the grandmother of the Special Operations submarine, proving the concept long before the technology was ready to support it perfectly. The wreck of the USS Argonaut lies somewhere in the deep darkness of the Solomon Sea, thousands of feet down. She has never been found. No remote-operated vehicle has ever shone a light on her resting place. She sits there in the crushing pressure, likely broken open by the implosion that marked her end, her steel slowly dissolving into the salt water. She is a war grave, protected by the depth and the isolation of her location. The men inside her are on what the submarine force calls eternal patrol. In the tradition of the service, a submarine that is lost is never listed as sunk. It is simply still on patrol, waiting for orders that will never come, its crew frozen in time, forever young, forever serving. As the war moved on, the tide turned against Japan. The newer, faster Gato and Balao-class submarines swarmed the Pacific, strangling the Japanese merchant marine and choking off the supplies to the islands. They avenged the Argonaut 1,000 times over. The destroyers that killed her, the Maikaze and Isakaze, would eventually meet their own violent ends, sunk by the overwhelming power of the U.S. Navy. But the Argonaut remains unique. She was the largest non-nuclear submarine the United States ever built. She was a giant who did her duty in a time when the odds were impossible. There is a profound sadness in the story of the Argonaut. It is the sadness of watching a heavyweight fighter who is past his prime step into the ring one last time against younger, faster opponents. She was loud, she vibrated, she leaked, and she was slow. But she was also beloved. She was the pearl of the Navy. To the men who served on her, she was not just a machine. She was a living thing with a personality, a temper, and a heart. They cursed her flaws, but they trusted her with their lives. And in the end, they died with her. History often focuses on the victors, on the ships that came home with flags flying and broomsticks tied to their periscopes to signify a clean sweep. We remember the USS Enterprise, the USS Missouri, the survivors. But it is essential to remember the ships that did not come back. The USS Argonaut represents the sacrifices made in the dark early days of the war, when victory was not guaranteed, and when men had to go to sea in imperfect ships to hold the line against a powerful enemy. The story of the Argonaut is also a reminder of the brutality of submarine warfare. It is a war of math and physics, where the variables are pressure, oxygen, and battery power. It is a war where there is no surrender. You cannot wave a white flag from 200 feet underwater. When the hull fails, the end is absolute. The 102 souls of the Argonaut faced that end together, in the dark, performing their duties until the water took them. Today, if you visit the submarine memorials at Pearl Harbor or elsewhere in the United States, you will find the name Argonaut etched in stone. It stands alongside the names of 51 other American submarines lost during World War II. But Argonaut stands out, not just for the length of the name, but for the weight of the loss. She took more men with her than any other boat. She was a Titan who fell, and the shock waves of her fall rippled through the entire Navy. We look back at her now through the lens of 80 years, and we see her for what she was, a flawed masterpiece, a bridge between the old Navy and the new, a vessel of immense ambition and tragic destiny. The USS Argonaut, SM-1, sleeps now. The vibrations of her diesel engines are gone. The shouts of the gun crews are silenced. The pinging of the sonar has faded. Only the ocean remains, the vast, blue, timeless ocean that she sought to conquer, and which ultimately became her shroud. Rest in peace, Argonaut. Rest in peace, sailors. Your watch is ended. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of the most tragic and fascinating chapters of naval history. Preserving the memory of these ships and the men who served on them is our mission, and we cannot do it without your help. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, please take a moment to click the subscribe button and turn on notifications. It is a small gesture that helps us keep history alive. Until next time, fair winds and following seas.